Hi, this is Professor Slaughter, and every week I'm going to take some time to give you an idea of what's going on in the news and how it relates to what we're studying in class. It may not make a whole lot of sense to you in the beginning of the semester because we have yet to talk about most of our topics, but you'll be doing article sets as well. So you'll have an opportunity to kind of tap in to different articles and think about them in the context of what we've learned. So I don't watch a lot of mainstream media. I have become very disenfranchised as a viewer. It takes about 30 seconds for them to tell me what's going on in the news, and then another 20 minutes to argue about it and be inflammatory. And I don't have time for that. So most of my knowledge of what's going on in the world is coming in through written resources. So every week I'm going to report from a different resource. Some of them I might use more than others. This is one that I really like, the Week magazine. For those of you who don't know my political orientation, I am not Republican and I am not Democrat. I don't think either one of them are doing a good job in getting this country going in the right direction, and they're being more divisive than uniting. So the reason why I think this is perfect, and I may be repeating myself, I'm not sure, but my conservative friends say this is too liberal, and my liberal friends say it's too conservative. So that means it's just absolutely perfect for me. So let me pick out some things that I saw in this week's issue of the Week magazine. And we'll start with what's going on in Copenhagen, Denmark. And this has a lot to do with foreign direct investment that's going to be, that they're hoping for in the coming year. So right here is a picture of them building these man-made islands. And certainly Copenhagen is not the first country to have done this. But they said that they're faced with a housing shortage and a shortage of office space. And so they're going to be building these 9 artificial islands off the coast of Copenhagen by 2040. And they're hoping to attract Silicon Valley firms. So we haven't really talked, it's early in the semester, so we haven't talked about foreign direct investment yet. But that's the flow of money from companies in one country into permanent investments in other countries. And usually we're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Certainly it could be less than that, but usually we're talking pretty big money. They're trying to attract tech firms. They want to be the Silicon Valley, like I said before. The government said the complex would include 33 million square feet of new land with space for some 380 new businesses and parks. And what they're doing is they're basically reclaiming land that was lost to the sea. So that's pretty interesting, and we'll see if building these islands actually increases the foreign direct investment going into Denmark. So another issue that's going on in Mexico City that has to do with the availability of the factors of production, which you would have learned about in Bus 100. In Mexico City, it says to crack down on the rampant theft of gasoline, Mexico's state oil company has shut off pipelines and started delivering fuel by tanker truck only, resulting in nationwide shortages and long lines at all the gas pumps. Pemex says that that at least $7.4 billion worth of fuel has been stolen since 2016 from criminal gangs. They are not only doing this by they're just tapping right into the pipelines, but they're also running hoses out of the refineries into their own trucks. So President Obrador has decided that enough's enough, and so he is at the risk of causing all these shortages. He's now mandated that all fuel be delivered by truck. So a boom for the trucking industry, no less. But definitely his actions trying to protect a factor of production of energy. Okay, so in Caracas, Venezuela, there's been an inauguration boycott. There was a presidential election wherein President Maduro was due to be sworn in this week for a second 6-year term following elections last May. And those elections were rigged, or not rigged, they were widely condemned as being rigged. Most major countries in the hemisphere, including the U.S., Canada, Brazil, and Argentina, didn't send diplomats to this event. So this is an example of how political pressures in the country is going to interrupt the flow of foreign direct investment into Venezuela, at least from these countries that feel that these elections were not legitimate. But it's also going to put any companies that are U.S. that are also operating in Venezuela at risk as well. So going into Budapest, they're having a lot of protests regarding this slave law, as they call it. Thousands of Hungarians protested in cities across the country last week against the increasing authoritarian rule of nationalist Prime Minister Orban. Protesters waved Hungarian and European Union flags as they marched against a new law dubbed the slave law by opponents that lets businesses demand that employees work up to 400 hours a year of overtime and allows companies to delay compensation for those hours for up to 3 years. So obviously this would put any company that's operating in Budapest or in Hungary right now in a kind of a weird situation, because obviously United States labor laws does not allow a company to go for 3 years without paying an employee. And this country actually has just passed a law allowing it. So again, this is what firms going into Hungary can expect in terms of differences in labor relations and in human resource law. Okay, so one of the stakeholders in business, of course, is the government, and the government can move in or advocate for certain positions that it wants a business to take that they feel is best for the people. And so there's a whole article in here about the redefining of the EPA, which of course puts a lot of pressure on businesses operating in this country. And so it says the agency was created by President Nixon in 1970, a time when industrial pollution shrouded cities and smog turned rivers and lakes into toxic stews of human waste and chemicals and left shorelines blackened by garbage and oil spills. It says these laws that have allowed the EPA to go after business. There's an argument here that those laws were job killers. So during the 2016 presidential campaign, Trump decreed the EPA as a job-killing bureaucracy that had needlessly hamstrung the American economy with costly regulations, which, and of course, anytime there's a change in government regulation, there's going to be an increase in cost, either through deregulation or in ramping up regulation. And so there was kind of a reorganization of the EPA. So the EPA has abolished a total of 47 environmental regulations and is in the process of rolling back 31 more. A separate analysis by Harvard Law School found that such rollbacks could lead to at least 80,000 additional deaths per decade and cause respiratory problems for more than 1 million people. So while it's good for business, it's bad for the community. So you have the government as one stakeholder wanting to increase the productivity of the economy and wanting to roll back some of these regulations to make it easier to do business in this country. And at the same time, then you have another stakeholder, which is the community and the employees, that also has an interest. And they're predicting that, Harvard is predicting that this is going to have a very, very bad outcome for the other stakeholder, one of the other stakeholders, and that is the community and the employees. It said these pollutants have been linked to cancer, cardiovascular disease, and neurological disorders. So got some conflicting stakeholder interest there. So at the beginning of the Business 280 course, there's a little video that you can watch that really gives you an idea of what the state of the world is. And it talks about populations that are living under the poverty line, who has access to clean water, who doesn't have access to the internet, how many people live in a house. You know, it's got kind of an idea of what the world looks like. And so there's an article here that was entitled Why 2018 Was the Best Year Ever. So uh, it starts out kind of negative. It says, everyone knows that the world is going to hell, says Nicholas Kristof. He said, but let me try to make a case that 2018 was actually the best year in human history. And what he did was he went around and looked at some other things that happened during that year. And he came up with some interesting numbers. He says now so let me go back a little bit. It says in the early 1980s, 44% of the world's population lived on less than $2 a day. He said that number's down to 10%. Every day on average, at least 295,000 people gained electricity for the first time. 305,000 gained clean drinking water for the first time, and another 620,000 were hooked up on the internet for the first time. So they're kind of talking, this article kind of refers to the fact that, 2018 did have some very, very important high points. So then we're going to roll over to Brazil and look at a situation that's going on with them that brings in the concepts of global ethics, and also, again, speaking back to the factors of production. So this article invites us to really think back on what we've done with our own history in terms of how we treated the Native Americans and taking their land when the Western Europeans started to populate the eastern shores of America. And it's very easy for us to look at that and say, we really didn't treat the Native American population right. But make no mistake, actions such as that are going on all over the world, even today. This is an example of it. But when we think about this situation, we developed our world, our country, by doing the same thing that we're telling Brazil not to do. So let me read a little bit about this. It says Brazil, Bolsonaro, that's the president of Brazil. It says Brazil, Bolsonaro goes after indigenous land. It says Brazil's new president has an ambitious plan to open up indigenous land to commercial mining and farming. And it says that nearly 13% of Brazilian territory, some 413,000 square miles, and then that's about the size of Texas and California combined, has been set aside for native tribes, including a large swath of the American rainforest. And he has vowed to say he's not going to let one more centimeter go to the indigenous people. So he's also taken away the right of the National Indian Foundation to decide on the lands claimed on the indigenous people, and he's put that into the agricultural department, and that's not very popular. So, of course, there's a lot of special interest groups and a lot of stakeholders that are criticizing what Bolsonaro is doing. But when we look at it, didn't we do the same thing here? And the same thing is going on in many other countries, and we don't ever hear about them. They don't write about those instances as well. We got two more articles I want to share with you, and then that'll be it. So there was a short article on iPhones, and the title of it is "iPhones is China Apple's only problem." And this article is basically saying that Apple's not doing very well in China, that they have missed their sales projections for the first time in 16 years, largely because of what's going on in China. And this article talks about that Chinese consumers are kind of tightening their belt. These are the wealthier consumers that we're talking about when we talk about buying and selling of iPhones. And Apple is now only the 5th largest phone seller in China. So it's toward the top of the list, but it's certainly not at the top. Companies like Huawei, Oppo, Vivo appeal to the local preferences more because they have greater, stronger, high-tech cameras that help more with selfies, which is something that's dominating how the phones are being used in China. In the US, smartphone users used to upgrade roughly every 24 months. Now it takes about every 35 months. So Apple has also been hurt by the durability of its own products. So when we look at what's going on in China, we still have this instance where, Apple is still talking up their successes and everything to their investors. And so this article also touches on the fact that Apple might have had a bad quarter, but it still beats the rest of the industry. And that is certainly true. But this article kind of accuses Apple of not being honest with the investors. But the article ultimately wraps up with a statement that says that Apple still dominates 90% of the handset industry. So let's look at Netflix in Saudi Arabia. So they've got some problems going on with their comedy, the Patriot Act. And Saudi Arabia, the government has basically said, we want you to censor that. We don't want it here. And so Netflix has agreed to a Saudi demand to block an episode of the Patriot Act. So when we start looking at market entry and we start looking at how products are distributed and how culture can impact the distribution of certain products and services, something like this is something that we should really think about, because this has to do with the government censoring a market entrant like Netflix for their own special purposes and expecting them to use a different standard when they do business in Saudi Arabia. So Netflix caved into this and said, okay, fine, we will block that episode. And it says, but by caving in, Netflix has set a precedent that it will compromise on free speech when looking for growth in emerging markets where government rule by less than savory means. Sure enough, Netflix says in a statement that it has to abide by foreign laws even when we disagree with them. And most companies that do business globally encounter that. And we will talk about that when we talk about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And again, when we talk about ethics, we'll talk about how different the business market can be. So thank you very much for listening to me, and you will be receiving instructions on what you need to do for your article sets coming up very soon. Thank you.